All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are talking about Dean Pease's epic WWE promo, talking about the Falcons' need for a culture change. We'll be talking about if Elijah Wilkinson is the team's new answer at left guard, as well as other odds and ends from Falcons training camp over the weekend.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at falcfans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline is where the game starts. So, guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course, on YouTube. You can get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops if you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. Hit that bell, give us a like while you do. So today's episode, we're catching you up with sort of the developments over the weekend. Friday and Saturday practice. It's really Saturday's practice that was the notable one that led to Arthur Smith coming out of that practice saying it was one of the most competitive he's had, if not the most competitive he's had since taking over the team a year ago. And, you know, notable about that practice was that there were two fights towards the end of it between various offensive linemen and defensive linemen, including everybody's favorite online bully, Anthony Rush, joking. But, you know, you want to see stuff like that, not necessarily the fighting per se, but you like hearing that it was a competitive practice, that basically the players essentially put on a show for all the fans in attendance on Saturday. You want to see that buzz being generated. You want to see this fan base get energized for that. And if they were able to get that from Saturday's practice, that's certainly a good sign. You know, the other notable thing from Saturday was that Brian Edwards, the Falcons wide receiver, was nicked up on that day, left practice with an upper body injury, shoulder, chest, arm, something along those lines. We'll probably have to wait and see on Monday to get an update on that. But it doesn't necessarily sound like the initial prognosis is a long-term injury. Maybe it'll keep him out of practice for a day or two, if that. You know, Monday is also notable because that's the first padded practice, and we'll get an opportunity to see what these trench players really can do rather than being focused in on the sort of 7-on-7 and 11-on-11 stuff that is more geared towards the skill position players. But with Brian Edwards' injury status, we're probably not going to get too much of an update because, you know, Arthur Smith is not necessarily known for being very giving with his injury updates and whatnot. And you know, that's kind of a pet peeve for the D Orlando Ledbetters of the world, also myself included. But someone who is very giving with his information in various press conferences is Dean Pease, and that was probably the biggest takeaway from the weekend, where Dean Pease basically, as I think Mike Rothstein put it of ESPN, cut a WWE promo on his press conference on Saturday, talking about the need for a culture change. One of the things he focused on was how essentially the Falcons have had bad defenses for basically the last 2 decades, most years, and that is a need that's going to change. And he mentioned, you know, having defenses on par with the Ravens, with the Patriots, two organizations that have been known for having very strong defenses over the last 2 decades. Not coincidentally, Dean Pease was part of those organizations for many of those years. And it's refreshing to hear Dean Pease say these things, because this is one of the reasons why, for me, Dean Pease's, you know, weekly press conferences, I think they usually were on Thursday during the season, were always, you know, must watch TV for me in that regard, because how real Dean Pease is. Like, he's not sitting here, you know, for lack of a better term, BSing you in some of the same ways that, you know, Arthur Smith often does. And that, you know, that's Arthur Smith's prerogative or whatever the case may be. But as I've said many times on the podcast, like, he treats media like mushrooms, keep them in the dark and feed them crap. And that he's allowed to do that. But, you know, it doesn't necessarily get the benefit of doubt from me personally when it comes to that stuff where, we didn't find out until like 6 months after the injury that Isaiah Oliver had an ACL tear. Like, how big an issue is it to basically say, oh yeah, he tore his ACL, he'll be out for the season? Like, you can nip that in the bud in 4 seconds, but that's too much of a mountain for Arthur Smith to climb sometimes. But I love Dean Pease in terms of his realness and his rawness when it comes to stuff like this. And notably, he talks about the culture, the need for a culture change here in Atlanta, and understandably certainly makes sense. I know that's been a topic that a lot of Falcon fans and as well as people in media circles have talked about a lot since Arthur Smith came in, and one of the biggest issues that this team faced. You haven't heard me talk too much about culture change, and part of that is just because culture is such an intangible thing. I tend to like to focus mostly on tangible things. Like, I remember, Mike Smith wrote a book. I didn't necessarily read it, but other people that did read the book basically talked about how much of it was, him talking about the decline of his regime here in Atlanta was because they didn't necessarily do a great job with the culture. And I get why coaches and even players focus on culture, particularly for people that are in the building every single day. I get why those people talk about culture. For us fans that are out, sort of outsiders with that sort of stuff, like, to me, culture is kind of whatever. And like in the case of like a Mike Smith, I'm like, he can focus on culture. I'm going to focus on the fact that their offensive line wasn't good, the fact that they couldn't run the football, the fact that their offense wasn't explosive and didn't really develop explosiveness, despite having explosive playmakers like Julio Jones in those latter years. Focus on injuries being a bigger issue in 2013 and 2014 than they were in previous years, the lack of a pass rush being a bigger issue in those years, etc. And so I look at those tangible things as reasons for the decline of Mike Smith. And the same thing applies whether Arthur Smith is trying to change the culture, DPs is trying to change the culture here. Like, get me more tangible things. Get me difference makers on the line of scrimmage. Get me, Will Anderson. Get me Jalen Carter. And I had to drop those bars on today's episode. But all of a sudden your culture is going to look a lot better when you can get after the quarterback, right? All of a sudden your culture is going to look a lot better when you can protect your quarterback, right? You got guys behind me, for those of you listening to the podcast or not watching the podcast, I'm pointing to a poster of Aaron Donald behind me. You got to block those guys and that's easier said than done. But like, all of a sudden you'll start having a winning culture when you have guys capable of blocking the Aaron Donalds of the world or the Cameron Jordans of the world, etc. And that to me is more of the things that I tend to focus on. So good on Dean Pease for getting out there and saying the things that I think a lot of people wanted to hear. And hopefully we'll see, Dean Pease and Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot follow in that vision. They focus a lot on, having the guys with the right makeup and all these various things. But give me Will Anderson, give me Jalen Carter. You'll start seeing the culture sort of change. And speaking of protecting guys from the Aaron Donalds of the world, we'll talk about maybe a new face that's going to help protect us from Aaron Donald, as ridiculous as that sounds. But we're talking about, the possibility of Elijah Wilkinson being the new answer at the left guard position. We talked a lot about going into training camp, whether or not we would see new starters or the Falcons going to run it back with the same starting five. And it seems like right now, the best bet for, not being a starter is Jalen Mayfield at left guard position, and he's going to be usurped by Elijah Wilkinson. We'll focus on sort of what Elijah Wilkinson is potentially bringing to the table as we continue today's episode, guys. But before we get there, you may be a quarterback looking for extra security in the pocket from pass rushers like Aaron Donald, and you may be not a quarterback looking for extra security when you come up with those sort of stressful situations where money can be a little tight. You're living paycheck to paycheck. I know for me, I'm always worried about my sort of car, and I already know I got to take it in the shop to get something else fixed on it moving forward, and that can bring a lot more stress into your life than you want. So why not have that extra security? And Dave can bring you that. And Dave's not a person. Dave is a banking app that can give you up to $500 instantly with extra cash. There's no interest, no credit check needed. Millions have already downloaded the Dave app, and you can too. Just go to the App Store right now and download Dave. That's DAVE. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve, member FDIC. Trust me, your future you will thank you. So we're talking about Elijah Wilkinson as potentially the new starter at the left guard because it's notable starting after day one of training camp where Jalen Mayfield got those first team reps. Elijah Wilkinson has gotten those first team reps at left guard for 3 straight days, and that is meaningful. We've seen the centers alternate day to day between Drew Dalman and Matt Hennessy. We haven't quite seen Jermaine Ifedi get mixed into those first team snaps at the right tackle position over Caleb McGarry. So it does seem like we might be still staying on that two-star resort called Caleb McGarry Island for at least a little while. We'll see what develops in this regard. But starting jobs aren't necessarily going to be won in practice. And at least for us, who aren't going to be there at practice every single day, we'll focus on what these guys can do in the games. And I mentioned before, you go back a couple of summers ago, where Ty Sambrailo was, kind of in the mix, getting those early team reps at right tackle early in camp, and then struggled in that second preseason game against the Jets. And all of a sudden that opened the door wide open for Matt Gano and eventually Caleb McGarry to sort of usurp him in that job. You can go back a few years earlier in that, in 2015, where James Stone was getting all the first team reps at left guard. Then Earl Mitchell showed up in a preseason game, absolutely wrecked him, and all of a sudden the Falcons like, okay, we got to go trade for Andy Levitri. So we'll have to sort of see what Elijah Wilkinson, as well as these other players that are in the mix in the starting lineup, when we get to the preseason games against Detroit in 2 weeks. And then, we got the Jets, I think, as the second preseason game. So, there's a history there. So that will be something to keep an eye on. But what's notable about Elijah Wilkinson is we haven't talked a lot about him on this podcast. We mentioned him sort of offhand. I didn't even have him on my 53-man roster projection that I put out last week. And presumably if there was a game tomorrow, he'd be the one starting at left guard. Now, we're obviously a month away from final cuts, and there's a lot that can happen between now and then. But it is notable that a player that I didn't even think was going to make the team, could potentially be the week one starter at the left guard position moving forward. And what's notable about Elijah Wilkinson is similar to kind of Jalen Mayfield. He's been primarily a right tackle in the NFL. If you look at his NFL career over 4+ years in the NFL, 72% of his regular season snaps have come at right tackle. He has dabbled as a left tackle. He has dabbled as a right guard. Notably in the preseason, the bulk of his snaps have come at right guard. About 45% of his snaps in 4 preseasons have come at right guard. And what's notable is he hasn't necessarily played any snaps of left guard in the preseason or in the regular season. So left guard is a new position for him moving forward, but he has started games at right guard, so it's not as if like it's a completely foreign concept like it was for Jalen Mayfield for him. He just has to basically switch his footwork, having some of those experience at right guard. He started 6 games at right guard for the Broncos in 2018. He gave about 19 pressures in those 6 games on roughly 300 pass blocking snaps. If you were to extrapolate that to the 622 snaps that Jalen Mayfield played last year, who gave up 57 pressures on his 600 plus snaps, when Wilkinson's, pressure allowance in that 2018 season would be about 40 pressures over the course of an entire season, which is an improvement from Jalen Mayfield, but would still probably rank him in the bottom 10 among guards in the NFL. Now, obviously, that was 2018, where we're sort of using that as our data point, and that was Wilkinson's second NFL season. And one would hope now that he's in like year 5 or year 6 or whatever, that he's improved upon there. So the hope is that he would be even better than that. But still, you're probably looking at a below average starter should he be the week 1 left guard. But as I mentioned back in June when we talked about the offensive line, and have mentioned a number of times over the last month, that I'm all open for having 3 new starters. We kind of saw what the starting 5 did a year ago. So if we get new starters at left guard, center, and right tackle, I'm not going to be complaining about that come week 1, since it feels like we kind of already know what the other starting 5 would potentially bring to the table. So we'll see if Wilkinson can be an upgrade over Jalen Mayfield. I feel like there's reasons to be optimistic that he can be, given that Jalen Mayfield was historically bad last year as far as guard play goes and as a rookie goes. And so you feel like a more veteran player like Wilkinson could at least raise the floor for what you can get at that left guard position. And frankly, as I've discussed before on the podcast, like, you're essentially looking for like 2019 James Carpenter at this point in time for the Falcons. And that's not very good. That's still a very bad guard, but it's better than what we had. And, as I often say on this podcast, when it comes to anything related to the Falcons in their trench play, beggars can't necessarily be choosers. So we'll see if Elijah Wilkinson can take this momentum from the first week training camp and continue to push that not only for upcoming weeks of practice as well as into preseason games, or if Jalen Mayfield, this is the sort of shot in the arm that will sort of inspire Jalen Mayfield, to light a fire under him to be better moving forward. So still a lot of time to go in training camp, but certainly promising signs that at least so far, it seems like one new starter is moving in the right direction as far as the starting five goes moving forward. So that's where we'll leave that conversation. We'll kind of wrap up today's episode talking a little bit more about some of the competitions along the defensive line, and if someone like a Vincent Taylor or Marlon Davidson are going to be able to provide what the Falcons are looking at that position. We'll also sort of touch on some other roster odds and ends, and why Mike Ford seemingly has gotten off to a good start in training camp, and why you're hearing a lot more about him getting more work with the sort of starting ones and twos in Isaiah Oliver's absence so far in training camp. And we'll get into all of that as we wrap up today's episode, guys. But before we get there, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, in which Locked On Falcons is part of. Locked On Sports Atlanta is 3 podcasts with 4 hosts breaking down not only local sports but national sports. They have, of course, Mark Zeno with A to Z, John Chuckery's Hitting Hard, and ATL Day Ones hosted by Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste. You can find them all on the same podcast feed on all the same podcast platforms that you listen or watch Locked On Falcons. And if you watch Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you'll also get the Locked On Braves postcast breaking down every Braves win and loss this season, as well as upcoming postcasts for the Atlanta Falcons in the preseason, in the regular season, where myself and Jarvis Davis will be breaking all of that down. So subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on your preferred podcast platform, as well as on YouTube, to get those updates moving forward. And guys, I also want to tell you about the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info, and that is, of course, betonline.net. From the latest odds, contests, or player props, you name it, BetOnline has it all. Whether you want to bet on Major League Baseball, UFC, boxing, esports, Vegas casino games, or upcoming preseason games where the Falcons are 3-point underdogs against the Lions in 2 weeks, or regular season matchups where the Falcons are 5.5-point underdogs against the Saints heading into week 1, or maybe you feel not great about that and you're feeling great about Aaron Donald's matchup against the Buffalo Bills, where the Bills are 1-point favorites in that Thursday night season opening kickoff game. Whatever you want, whether it's offensive rookie of the year, Arthur Smith coach of the year odds, installing that new culture, or whatever the case may be, you can find it all by heading over to the website at betonline.net to take advantage of the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. So just a couple of odds and ends, some things that I've noticed over the first couple of days of training camp, and I haven't necessarily seen some people touch upon. One of them is Mike Ford seemingly getting a lot more run with the early team units than probably a lot of people anticipated. It's not really a surprise to me because, it's about how the teams construct their active and inactive roster. And this is why, roster nerds like me pay attention to this stuff. Unfortunately, I think far too many people look at the active list or inactive lists and look at it as like, oh, this guy's in the doghouse, or this is how the coaches feel about a player. And it's really just a numbers game. You got to get 48 guys active on game day. And, for the most part, there's 36 to 38 guys, depending on what team and what systems you have, that are going to play offense and defense. And the remaining 10 or so guys are basically purely special teams guys. And this is where sort of Mike Ford figures into the mix. You always hear it from me, special teams matter, all that various things. But typically the Falcons are going to have 5 active cornerbacks on game day. You got your 3 starters in AJ Terrell, Isaiah Oliver, and Casey Hayward. Then you're going to have 2 backups, and primarily those guys are going to be performing on special teams. Like, people forget that Darren Hall was inactive for the first 4 games of the season until Isaiah Oliver's season-ending injury, and that was largely due to the fact that Darren Hall didn't really have a clear-cut special teams role. And so for those first month of the season, the 2 backup corners that were active on game day, besides Terrell Oliver and Fabian Moreau, were TJ Green and Avery Williams. Now, Avery Williams' role in special teams was obvious. TJ Green was sort of their primary backup corner. In the event of an injury, he would go into the game, at least for the outside corners, while Avery Williams stepped in when Isaiah Oliver went down, because he was the primary backup nickel cornerback. And essentially where Mike Ford sort of figures in, he's kind of taking that Avery Williams spot, replacing Avery Williams now that he's going on to the offensive side of the ball, playing that running back position. And so that's why you're seeing Mike Ford get a lot more run, not only as an outside corner, but as an inside corner, because whoever those backup cornerback, those 2 backups are going to be, you need to have that flexibility to be able to step in on game day and be able to play any one of those three cornerback spots because you don't know who's going to go down. If Isaiah Oliver, gets hurt again, hopefully not a long-term injury, but has to miss a quarter or two, someone's got to come in and play those nickel snaps. And you better hope Mike Ford and whoever the other backup cornerback has that flexibility. We know Darren Hall has that ability, but it's really kind of a competition for that one other spot with Mike Ford probably locking down one of those spots. It's going to be a competition between Darren Hall, D. Alford, and presumably Cornell Armstrong as the three guys that seem to be getting the most buzz in the early part of camp. And they're essentially going to be taking over that TJ Green role. And hopefully we can get more production out of that, which shouldn't be too hard to do than what TJ Green was able to provide. And so we'll just sort of have to see how that plays out. But Mike Ford is one of those guys that I wouldn't sit here and say he's a lock to make the roster, but because he's going to be that gunner on the punt team and it doesn't seem likely that someone's going to unseat him for that spot, you can pretty much bet that Mike Ford is going to be active on game days, and having that flexibility to be able to play outside or inside is certainly going to add value to what he can bring to the table defensively. And, we haven't necessarily considered this because we were kind of expecting Darren Hall or Alford or Cornell Armstrong to sort of take that opportunity to be that, top outside corner in the event of an injury to to Casey Hayward or AJ Terrell. But, Mike Ford could also be in the mix there. So we'll keep an eye on this cornerback battle. This is one of the bigger question marks on the defense from a depth standpoint. How good is the Falcons cornerback depth? Because we talk so much about, hey, we got three great starters, but what happens when someone tweaks an ankle or, busts their wrist or whatever the case may be and has to miss a game or two or whatever that is. So, I'm trying not to say whatever the case may be as often, but whatever that is. And so you need guys like Mike Ford and others to potentially step up. So just wanted to touch upon that. We'll sort of wrap up today's episode talking a little bit about the defensive line. I heard a lot of people in those first couple of days seeing sort of the notion that Taquan Graham and Anthony Rush were starting alongside Grady Jarrett as far as the Falcons 3-man unit. But what I didn't see get as much coverage was the fact that it was Vincent Taylor and Marlon Davidson, at least in base off of the early training camp reports, that were getting some of those nickel snaps, those sub-package snaps. And that to me is a lot more notable because we didn't quite see this with the Dean Pease defense last year, but it was very clear in the previous regime under Dan Quinn and company that there was a clear, very distinct line between the base defensive line and the nickel defensive line. We saw guys like Tyler Davison and Brooks Reed and Derek Shelby over the years be that base unit, but then in those sub packages and those nickel looks, you'd see Vic Beasley and Tack McKinley and Grady Jarrett and Jack Crawford, etc., get a lot of those reps. And I'm curious if the Falcons are going to revert more to this style of defense this year, given some of the concerns that they have along their defensive line. We know that majority of NFL teams, the Falcons are no different, are in the nickel the majority of the time. That's why you hear terms like nickel is a new base. According to Football Outsiders, the Falcons played nickel 74% of the time last year, which was the fourth highest rate in the NFL. And for those of you that are not familiar with what nickel means, that's whenever you see five defensive backs on the field. It's also often called sub packages, particularly when it's referring to the fronts and whatnot. And so one of the reasons why we were excited about Eddie Goldman signing was that Eddie Goldman could give you not only value as a base defender, but also in the nickel defender, similar to what you expect out of Grady Jarrett. And without him, being in the lineup, you may not necessarily see one single player getting the majority of those reps, and you may see it divvied up like it was under Dan Quinn, where you have a Taquan Graham and an Anthony Rush playing primarily in the team's base package, but in those nickel situations when the Falcons are playing their 2-4 or 4-2 front, whatever you want to call it, that other defensive lineman lined up next to Grady Jarrett on the interior, which is and remains a big question mark. Could that be filled by a Vincent Taylor or Marlon Davidson? It seems like that's the direction where the team is heading. And it makes sense because those are the two guys that when you look at this group are the more talented pass rushers of this group. We haven't necessarily seen Marlon Davidson live up to that talent in his first 2 years, two injury plagued years. He only has 4 pressures in 2 seasons combined. When you look at a player like Vincent Taylor, you see a much better body of work as a pass rusher, but obviously injuries have hurt him throughout his career and he hasn't necessarily put it all together. But when you just look at his career body of work combined, like he has 389 career pass rush snaps and he has about 25 pressures on those snaps. And one of the things we talked about when we signed Eddie Goldman was this idea that Eddie Goldman could take all the snaps that were formerly given to Tyler Davidson and Jonathan Ballard and Mike Pennell in the defense last year, which would roughly combine to be about 467 pass rush snaps between those three players. And based off of how Eddie Goldman has played throughout his career, you could realistically see a range, depending on how well he played, between like 18 and 30-ish pressures based off of Eddie Goldman's body of work on that sort of snap load. And sort of the point with Vincent Taylor is that he's had a similar snap load over like 5 seasons in the NFL. And so if you can get him to play at a similar level, you could theoretically get comparable production out of Vincent Taylor as you're potentially could have been expecting out of Eddie Goldman. And, while that's not elite in terms of what you're getting next to Grady Jarrett, again, Jalen Carter would probably hopefully give you a little bit more juice in that arena, but it is comparable. 30-ish pressures is about what Jack Crawford gave you in 2018. I think Dante Poe had about 40 pressures in 2017. So that's somewhat close to what the Falcons were getting out of their interior pressure alongside Grady Jarrett back when they had, decent options there and weren't terrible as far as their pass rush goes. And the other notable thing about Marlon Davidson that he told our very own Jarvis Davis was that he's seemingly in better shape and has a little bit more lower body strength because the various lower leg injuries that had plagued Marlon Davidson early in his career led to the fact that he couldn't even squat in his first 2 NFL seasons. And this offseason was the first time since his rookie year that he's been able to get back in the gym and do those squats. So hopefully that's a sign that he has that lower body explosiveness that will lead to him being a lot more effective as a pass rusher should he be in the mix to be that guy next to Grady Jarrett. We know that when we drafted him in 2020, the expectations were that in those sub-package situations, he would be the guy next to Grady Jarrett, and that did not prove to be consistently the case, in large part due to those injuries and COVID and various other factors. And so hopefully, Marlon Davidson is able to get back on track to being more of what we thought he could be when we initially drafted him. Again, I'm not expecting him to suddenly look like a superstar, second round pick or anything like that. But certainly if he can, give us, 20-ish, 25 or 30 pressures, I think that was kind of what our expectations were his rookie season. I think I projected him for like 25 pressures as a rookie. And like, if we can get that this year, that would be big improvement from what the Falcons had at that interior D-line position a year ago. And certainly Vincent Taylor's also in the mix. So that to me was kind of notable that, maybe Vincent Taylor, maybe Marlon Davidson can kind of be Eddie Goldman light. Now, I still sit here very skeptical of this D-line room and still feel like this is going to be a position that the Falcons are going to have to scour their waiver wire later this summer once start cuts are made to get more help there. Anthony Rush, don't kill me, but if particularly guys like Davidson and Taylor can step up, maybe that won't be as big an issue as we thought. So we'll just sort of have to keep an eye on that. And particularly when we get into the games, hopefully you can see some of these guys start kicking the butts of these second and third string offensive linemen. And that will be a promising sign for their future and what they can do this year. So certain things to keep an eye on. We'll see if, these guys can help facilitate that culture change that Dean Pease is so gung-ho about. There were some other comments that Dean Pease made about, some high-priced veteran players. You could probably read something into that if you so desired. Maybe we'll touch upon that on future episodes with some of the guests that we'll have on this week to keep you guys, informed on what's going on in Falcons training camp as we sort of build up to these preseason games where we can actually start to see a little bit more of what these guys can do in game as opposed to what they're doing against practice. But so far, so good. Nice to see the Falcons have a great practice on Saturday, and we'll see if they can continue that on Monday in padded practice as things move forward throughout this summer. So guys, that will do it for us here. I appreciate anybody that tuned in today and anybody who wants to provide their feedback on anything that they have observed or heard or want to know about Falcons training camp so far. Now that we're 4 or 5 days in, you of course can provide your feedback via Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And of course, you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. So, guys, that's going to do it for us here. Always thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. Always recommend what your second listen should be. And of course, why not check out Locked On NFL to get the lowdown on all 32 teams' NFL training camps, not just the Falcon stuff. But of course, always check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves, as well as possible second, third, fourth, and fifth listens. So appreciate it, guys. Till then.